Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to anyone who's joining us right now. I'm delighted to continue this session with our next speaker, first speaker in part 2 on Beirut and Japan in the 1960s. And that speaker is Ali Jabbar, who teaches at the Lebanese Academy of Fine Arts and is currently pursuing PhD research in Derridian hauntology and deconstruction in relation to the cinemas of Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. As you can see, Ali's talk is, titles on the screen, Beirut, the Ancient City of the Future, on hauntology, vaporwave, and the sounds of nostalgia for lost futures. Just before Ali begins, this is a reminder to anybody that you can post questions using the chat function at any point during the talk, and then after 20 minutes, we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay, over to you, Ali.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to Lola for organizing this and giving us the opportunity to speak, and thank you to the panelists as well for the nice seminar so far. So my paper, as the title says, is Beirut, the Ancient City of the Future, on Hauntology, Vaporwave, and the Sounds of Nostalgia for Lost Futures. Now, to start with, as you can see, this is a text that I found sprayed on one of Beirut's ruins, asking spectators to reflect on the atrocities of the Lebanese past. Providing no information on its creator or their whereabouts, the starkly black paint marks the concrete wall with the obscure message, Beirut 60, Ain Romani 75, Solidaire 94, Windows 95. Hurriedly sprayed in black paint, evoking a sense of urgency, as if the writer left his trace in haste. Or in a haste. Perhaps the message is intended as a kind of black humor in an aptly saturated, dehistoricized consumer world, particularly as it became widely shared across the internet, as meme, of course. Patrick Jameson would get the joke. The internet medium through which we are reviewing this image has contributed to the suppression of history. The events of Ain Romani of 1975, signaling the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War. Solidaire's 1994 development project, which acted as a mechanism to suppress history, and Windows 95 may well have been comparable in their historical significance and respective contributions to human suffering. However, this text seemed to radiate with haunting effects. The 1975 event evokes effects of suffering and catastrophe that remain felt in the living present, brought into the collective consciousness through aesthetics of rubble, but somewhat obscured through an amnesiac present and bleakly warming sense of otherness. Good thing you weren't there would be the utterance. But there is also the curious evocation of Beirut during the 1960s, a period often romanticized as the golden age of Beirut. In hindsight, it might seem paradoxical to include a time of prosperity alongside traumatic events, considering what this era represents in the Lebanese cultural memory in terms of economic progress, modernism, or utopian pre-sectarian divide. It was different back then. This period, of course, was to be canceled by the Civil War. If there is one thing that these events bring to mind is the apocalyptic note of what Derrida calls endism. Granted, the revolution of Windows 1995 functioned as the index to the final moment of departure into the hyper-reality of late capitalism, a system that was perceived as a window for a better future that was never to be. Conversely, the end of the Lebanese future thrust of 1960s, ended by the war, had effectively turned the period into a utopia where the future remained. Whereas Solidaire's post-war urban reshuffling turned the symbolic landscapes of Beirut's central district into a hyperspace, a simulacra that ghosted history by reinventing it as a category of the hypermarket and thereby imposing the conditions of historical amnesia onto the present. But as Derrida reminds us, hauntology is about defying any form of ending. At every end, there is a ghost awaiting its return to exert its hauntological influence on the present. There is something quite haunting about all of this. Anonymous texts, hidden sources, haunting images, the utter strangeness of the familiar everyday world. Those are also the ghostly matters of Vaporwave, the mysterious internet-born genre, cloaked with a strange haze of anonymity, with its sources disarmingly oblique. These digital ghosts are like revenants, making themselves present through the voids of the internet and prompting listeners to engage with the musics that come from nowhere, that can be attributed to no one, or at least, or at best, a faceless moniker. Much like ghosts, Vaporwave's music creates a crisis in temporality by bringing back the past to a more immediate sonic presence to haunt the present. Born out of microcultures such as C-punk and chillwave in the early 2010s, Vaporwave producers plunder from a bizarre and disparate canon of nostalgic sonic and visual artifacts from 1980s and 90s, spanning music, commodity aesthetic, Windows 95 glitch, quasi-utopian aesthetic elsewhere, and other nostalgia-inducing artifacts omnipresent across the consumerist world. These artifacts depict what the past might have looked like and remain available for retromaniac fetishization in hyper-capitalism. This creates a ghosted past that is only the product in a collective unconscious, sculpted through mediatized images, which in turn gives Vaporwave's sound both a comforting familiarity and uncanny unfamiliarity. To achieve this tension, Vaporwave producers chop and mix those sounds and visuals in short and repetitive forms with vocal samples, slowed down and positioned low in the mix, saturated with heavy reverb to produce a stretched out quality. Such sonical manipulation makes the sounds appear as if they are emanating from a place beyond time, eliciting nostalgia for a past that never actually existed, and also providing a lost future that was never realized, but as well producing a hyper-reality rooted in substanceless in consumer capitalism, which exposes the emptiness underlying the glossy sheen of commodity image. Thus, Vaporwave has traditionally been understood as a critique of late capitalism by raising questions about the relationship between consumer culture as instantiated in consumer imagery and cultural memory or nostalgia, to highlight how dreams sold about some utopia did not come to pass. This resonates with Adam Turner, who writes that Vaporwave's plunderphonics is informed by this new era of cultural and informational oversaturation, symptomatic of the fusion between both collective popular memory and the personal histories of their creators, steeped in a desire to visit the past. Thus, Vaporwave celebrates personal attachment to the past while pushing the sources of that nostalgia into defamiliarized musical performances. This is emblematic of the Lebanese-based Vaporwave, which I use as case study to extend on Turner's discussion of memory and nostalgia to explore the genre's memory play that takes misremembering as its audio-visual aesthetic. However, the memory play could be a proxy for an underlying repressed trauma and bereavement as consequences of loss, making Vaporwave intrinsically hauntological. This spectral agency is also present in the name Vaporwave, a spoof on vaporware, the name given for non-existent or ghost products promoted by corporations to fend off competitors. Like these unrealized products that were promised but remain spectral, Vaporwave is also predicated on the unfulfilled promise, the promise for a future that was sold but was never delivered. The Lebanese past future, which succumbed to war, wasn't immune to commodification after its end. Its loss instilled in the Lebanese contemporary a nostalgia mode, yearning for a time where the future remains. It is this self-conscious exploration of nostalgia that differentiates Vaporwave from other forms of nostalgia production and gives it its hauntological dimension. I will explore, of course, how Vaporwave confronts the specters of the lost future through a hauntological treatment of time and space. In confronting the present non-presence of the Lebanese past, Vaporwave points out absence through its dyschronia and opens a dialogue with unfulfilled ambitions of some past future. It does so, however, as a somber reflection on the Lebanese modern condition and as a deconstructive strategy that unghosts the specters of the future. So to begin with, Vaporwave's music plays with nostalgia, more specifically with the idea of nostalgia for things that never happened. We can understand this nostalgia through Huyson's compensatory nostalgia or hyperamnesia, which is generated via the paradox between remembering, or the rift here, between remembering and forgetting. Of course, we can see compensatory nostalgia as a symptom of the relationship between memory and forgetting under cultural pressure and the result of a new information technologies and media politics. Considering that many of the mass-marketed memories we consume are imagined memories to begin with, and thus forgotten faster than lived memories. That's why I think that compensatory nostalgia is applicable to Lebanese-based Vaporwave, as it resonates with one of the producers, Victech, he goes by the name Victech 1988, who says, I consider Vaporwave a kind of fuzzy, cloudy memory. Being born in 1989, I don't recall the 1990s, and vaguely remember the 2000s. Most of my knowledge of what life was like back then is based on people's memories or mixed media. Victech, who is a Lebanese Vaporwave producer, point to how memory, or words point to how memory can be produced by and through the media system, particularly in ways that feel personal but which are in fact amalgamated through media saturation. Reynolds, of course, or Simon Reynolds, views this sort of nostalgia as a symptom particular to commodified pop culture, inducing that peculiar nostalgia, and I quote here, that you can feel for the glory days of living in the now that you didn't actually live through. For instance, the text track, Mish Naseek, or You're Still on My Mind, exemplifies this confusion between personal and collective memory, which I will play in a second, mediated by nostalgia. The track comprises a lo-fi bricolage of samples spanning themes of 1990s TV ads that people born after 1980 might remember by either experiencing directly or indirectly as children, for instance, overhearing television from other rooms. The aesthetic of reverb produces a faraway quality that sounds as if it is floating in from another space or non-space. Some of the tracks sampled by Victek, which I will play actually now. This is Mish Naseek. So as you can see, some of the tracks sampled by Victek are difficult to identify, but resemble the recognizable tunes of the 1990s, reproduced with low density spacing and distorted quality, which engenders a strange feeling of nostalgia for something that never happened. So Vaporwave nostalgia is therefore not about processing, fixed displacement, or yearning for home. Rather, the listener draws upon their own reservoir of past experience, but only to plug into the intricate and collective reproduction of memory as a form of play, albeit one that is produced within the margins of liminality or in-betweenness. Therefore, memory is culturally sourced by Vaporwave's aesthetic to produce this form of nostalgia. In another track by Tripoli Wave, entitled Ahlam Saida, or Nice Dreams, the producer slows down samples from the soundtracks of popular 1990s sitcoms, which are at once highly distinctive, yet highly generic, retrieving the sense of nostalgia for the now depleted aesthetics of the era. These aesthetics define the popular culture of the time, and Vaporwave deploys these artifacts to generate the sense of shared memory for times and places that one may recognize but cannot quite place. What this all indicates is the relationship between media and the production of nostalgia without real memory, or what Apudarai calls Risat's nostalgia, symptomatic of culture's nostalgia mania. For her, advertising, consumer technology, and nostalgia have become codependent, and the nostalgia is a product of the promises made by consumer medias which were never met. As Boehm writes, advertising is frequently used to recreate visions of the past which had exacerbated modern nostalgia. Vaporwave's aesthetic plunders from disparate times that become conflated by acquired memory and advertising media. By doing this, Vaporwave is distorting memory in order to compose a liminal remembering experience in which memory at once occurs and does not occur. Vaporwave, or actually, I want to include a third track, which is, I think, very important, which is also by Triple Wave, called Sleepwalking, which gives the listener flashbacks to the 1990s and early 2000s. These flashbacks are sampled from local commercials that often portrayed family gatherings, kids playing basketball, or coming-of-age stories. The flashbacks are associated here with an imagining of ads that remain alive in the Lebanese cultural memory. References to memory in such Vaporwave tracks are often spectral or doubled, a strange nostalgia for a dream of better times that were nothing but an ad. Thus, Vaporwave deals in displaced or fractured memories, things that never actually happened. There is the possibility that somehow our recollection is perturbed. What we have sort of forgotten and what we sort of remember are colored by the numbing horror of recent history, the chronic threat and fatigue of local violence and increasing social and economic instability, the ramifications of the civil war, and the radical urban reorganization of history under Solidaire. Our present is haunted by a past we are unable to deal with, Here, Vaporwave's play with memory and temporality is such as to make it the soundtrack for emptiness of an innocence destroyed, one that cannot be made sense of, a moment in the articulation of repression and the trauma of loss. Thus, the uncanny thing about this non-memory is the possibility that it is a proxy for memories of something unresolved and unspeakable. Vaporwave signals our arrival at an impasse. A better future has become unimaginable, arguably disappeared in time. Just the same, Vaporwave shows that we know and mourn, in fact, this fact, and perhaps perform nostalgia for something better. This explains why Vaporwave sounds the way it does, a hypnagogic reverie of loss, trauma, ennui, and exhaustion, an indictment of the broader cultural and political terrain. The music dramatizes the culture's nostalgic fixation on the past, which in turn highlights the impossibility of the future. Thus, Vaporwave does not only expose how we are haunted by the loss of the future, but also foregrounds how we are haunted by the disappearance of history as the collateral damage of our violent past. To go back to history a bit, between 1950s and, or between 1950s and 1975, the Lebanese Riviera became a globalized site of exchange, inheriting the hybrid sensibilities of a colonialized nation, plus the amalgamated identity of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish confessions, and modernizing and mediating Lebanon with the capacity to accommodate Arab customs and European exoticism. Often poetized as the Paris of the Middle East and the Switzerland of the Orient, Beirut's cosmopolitan history is deeply entangled in a decadent and violent past that precedes the war and implicates the duplicity of an other Paris existing in ruins. Although the culture of bikini-clad tourists and multicultural modernity of the historic representations highlight an ideal Lebanon, this pre-war period already bears the inscription of a country of a contrary political climate, which culminated in two civil wars. Some of the living records and historic representations of that era are mediatized images produced by the BBC, whereas others came from local studios, such as Studio Baalbek, coincidentally ran by a major bank at that time, which was Intrabank. These records promoted the cosmopolitan non-spaces of Lebanon and its central district by containing visuals representing the most picturesque sites, hotels, malls, beaches, airports, and banks, the any spaces, whatever, of capital. All of this, however, veiled the underlying sectarian political and economic tension, which ended the Lebanese modernist dream. As Qasir puts it, Beirut's many masks converged to create the image of an idyllic place, an image now converted by nostalgia into the memory of lost golden age. Of course, shortly after the end of the war in 1990, Solidaire, led by then Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, undertook the reconstruction of Beirut's central district, a project of memory erasure by way of executing an imagined transformation of Beirut into a glittering modernist metropolis, such as Dubai. Many of the city's historic buildings were leveled and replaced by high-rises. The policy of forgetting was drawn by the country's wartime leaders, largely comprising former warlords, wartime Syrian clients, and war entrepreneurs. The basis of this policy was drawn from the famous dictum of no victors, no vanquished, which was endorsed by Hariri. The massive reconstruction of Beirut's central district and its prerequisite bulldozing of much of downtown was, as described by Hogbol, a privatized corporate attempt to spectacularize history. By disregarding the collective memories of the now displaced local population in favor of imposing its own vision or version of the area's past, in itself spectacularized by historical idealization. Solidarity's systematic rebuilding of the old city's facades coincided with the transforming the area into an ultra-consumerist hub, where the downtown area underwent a sort of spatial simulation, becoming a picture-perfect model of the old Beirut by way of stripping the area of its real history. By reconstructing a fake past based on a fake original, Solidarity's new space resembles a drained hyperspace that is characterized by a depoliticized past, reproduced by an ethos of consumerism and capitalism, and characterized by a mimetic nature primarily guided by the non-representational logic of the simulacrum. Such logic, we can call as the kind of logic of the urban palimpsest, a uniquely postmodern problematic adopted by Solidaire, created a cartography that juxtaposes at once Beirut's past, present, and future by reworking the past into the present. Here, the metaphor of the urban palimpsest is useful in suggesting the polychronicity of the new space, where time is out of joint. To use Hamlet, its urban and cultural components are removed from the proper or temporary place, disarranged and confused. The anachrony is reflected in Solidaire's one of Solidarity's slogans, Beirut, the ancient city of the future, which reflects the disjointedness of the Lebanese living present, suspended between a nostalgia for a past that is no longer and for a future that is yet to come. Put differently, the untimely halt of progress induced a sense of nostalgia for a lost future which the era might have contained. At work here is a collective nostalgia for a future, a longing for a fragments of a half-hearted post-war attempt at rekindling the future, which lies in the ruins of the economic stagnation and sectarian turmoil that resumed in the wake of Hariri's assassination in 2005. Thus, what haunts the Lebanese present is not the no longer of that past, but the not yet of the future that the capitalist democracy had promised, which never materialized. Vaporwave foregrounds the Lebanese relationship to memory, while remaining critical of the culture's nostalgic obsession and fascination with some utopian past. I will explain certain characteristics of the genre and detail how Vaporwave is the musical product of a culture plagued by trauma, loss, disappearance, and aggression under capitalism. Amid the fatalities, I will not go much longer, but just to point out a couple of points. Amid the fatalities that mark Vaporwave, it seems that disappearance is the prevailing undercurrent, chiefly felt in the genre's mourning of the loss of the material markers of collective memory as a result of Solidarity's urban makeover. The disappearance of the sites of memory corresponds to the disappearance of common experiences and the rallying points for shared memory. Such sites are anchors of historical continuity and connection across time. For Vaporwave producers, Beirut's downtown became a sign without any fixed signifier, defined by inherent unpredictability and urbanism that is unknowable, paradoxically rooted in the not here and the not yet, which produces a sense of atemporality and a spatial disintegration. Against this thesis of loss, Vaporwave producers utilize their music to exercise a sort of politics of emergence, invoking a memory through dwelling on absence while performing a conscious palimpsestic remembering as translated into the music aesthetics, which tempers with the sense of spatio-temporal and historical disorientation as accentuated by capitalism. For instance, the album Empty Dwelling, 1990, an hour-long visual and sonic mix, where the producer intersects a series of contemporary photographs of downtown Beirut with familiar photographs of the now disappeared monuments. By juxtaposing these modern images with archaic ones, replacing presence with absence, what is produced is a haunting effect, and as absence looms as one more node of violence in this intricate remapping of the downtown area. Bricolaging time in the service of memory reconstruction nevertheless invokes the blank space of its source. By constructing a bifurcated visuals, the producer invites the spectator to reflect on the pressures that absence exerts upon the act of seeing, to fill upon the fissures or things missing. Bound up here is the possibility that the play between memory and non-memory takes place. Intersecting with the interplay is the recontextualization of the insatiable feeling of disjointedness delivered sonically in its expressed form, hazy, looping, fragmented, and unclear, as the abstract soundscape of noise takes place. Only interrupted occasionally by the distorted traces of familiar songs, with each sample looped until it is jarringly interrupted by another sample, moving the listener through the ambiguous maze of time. Through these time slips that we hear that time is out of joint, as the faint traces of familiar tunes rupture through the fabric of time. These sonic traces are racked with collective grief, particularly when they pour through the contemporary images. If the imagery of the new facades rests on the privileging of the here and now, then the metaphysics of trace and noise are about dyschronia and fragmentation. Such vanguard tactics distort the very distinction between past and present, unsettling the illusion of presence. Temporarily, by alerting us to the fact that what we are listening to and seeing is a revenant, a captured slice of the past erupting into the present.
There's some comments in here about possible intertexts and other films to think about. I'll take one comment from Jack, one of our speakers in another session, who's asking the question whether it's possible, can musical sampling in late capitalism evoke nostalgia? In other words, if nostalgia is produced into material form, is it still nostalgia, or is nostalgia doomed to a perpetual state of inner longing and things stuck in thoughts? I wonder if you have any.
Where is the question? Sorry.
That's from Jack Blaskevitz.
Can musical sampling in late capitalism evoke nostalgia? Of course, because it's symptomatic of nostalgia. The problematic for theorists such as Simon Reynolds or Mark Fisher's hauntology, at least Mark Fisher's hauntology, is that there is no, we cannot imagine a future which is very negative concerning aspects of sampling or plunderphonics or any kind of regression towards the past. However, Simon Reynolds would say otherwise. Simon Reynolds would say, I think it would be a bit more positive regarding creativity, but because it's also palimpsestic. Actually, vaporwave as a genre, yes, it does evoke nostalgia, but what you can also argue, because it's also a kind of symptomatic of late capitalism through our consumption of material images or mediatized images, commodities, and so on. I think what vaporwave does in a way is not only, it's still entrenched in nostalgia, it's still regressive, yet at least its ontological dimension would be just for grounding the kind of disjointedness or a lack of futurity that we are now unable, or the future that we are now unable to produce. This is in the context of Western late capitalism. So yes, it would be, I think, symptomatic of late capitalism. It does, however, yes, evoke nostalgia. It actually lives on nostalgia. However, the nostalgia it speaks of is a nostalgia that never happened or goes past.
I'm going to pick up, there's two questions we've had actually about gender. So one from Amanda says she was struck by how Beirut and Rome were spoken about in feminine terms in the previous panel. And then another question from Daniel Richter saying, from my understanding of cinematic portrayals upon Beirut, there are many prominent depictions by female directors. And just asking if there's a gendered reading of vaporware or how gender plays into your understanding.
In a way, it doesn't, because what's interesting about vaporwave is that it is in itself an embodiment of spectrality, is that it functions beyond gender, beyond monikers, beyond any historical reference, any detached, like a sign that's moving around. So it doesn't have any preference per se. I cannot speak of how it could be gendered because I have no idea who I know only two producers. That's what I actually based the research on interviews with. But the rest, they just appear usually on the dark web, actually. And they disappear, they just flicker in and out of sight, or between presence and absence. They just disappear and then they reappear again, the tracks. So you cannot know. I know in the Western context, however, there are a couple of very prominent female vaporwave producers. One is Fatima Al-Qadri. There's Victroid, which I think sometimes is the same person. But that's what the confusion is. So I cannot really quite, that's the, I think.
Thank you. I mean, it's really clear from the volume of questions here that there's a lot more. We're not going to have time to get into it. I will use chair's privilege slightly because Abby Waisdorf has asked a better version of a question I wanted to ask. So she says, I'm curious about how vaporwave is distributed in Beirut. So it's an internet genre, but what are the networks? Who's involved? How does it operate?
Distribution would be against the whole philosophy of vaporwave, I think. The whole idea of vaporwave is to show you that culture has become commodified. So they exist outside of commodification. What they do is that they recycle the ghosts of those commodities, or how at least we consume them. So distribution would actually negate the purpose of vaporwave. Vaporwave primarily just exists on the internet, sometimes on the web. Again, that would defy the whole philosophy of vaporwave.
Yeah, I suppose it would be interesting to have a kind of an ethnography of the digital practice of vaporwave alongside this, theoretical approach to think of some of those questions. But I'm afraid we're going to have to thank Ali there because we've run out of time. I'm sure we all can keep talking about more.
I won't talk about that.
No, not at all. No, fantastic paper. So thank you very much.